All right,
Very.
there's that. So, I forgot to tell you. So I've been asking everyone at the end of every episode that I've done this year. So I've been warning people when I'm in the mood to warn people, but I feel like warning you. So the last question that I usually plan on asking is, when you say the word God or divine or whatever word, whatever metaphor you'd like to try to use,
Right.
what do you actually mean? Like, what are you actually
Gotcha.
saying? But
Gotcha.
don't answer it yet. It's just
Gotcha.
sometimes I tell people that and they're like,
They go right on ahead and
or they just give a platitude.
yeah.
So, well, here we go. Uh, Bushi, YamatoDamashii. And if I didn't say that right, it's fine. I
You
guess it's
did
fine anyway.
right. It's
So,
perfect.
you're terrified of names that I'm not used to saying. So, welcome to the show. I'm
Thank
excited to talk to you. You came highly recommended from many, many friends of mine when
Oh
I
wow.
said, hey, I want to talk to people that are doing different things. And your name popped up 7 or 8 different times. So, thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much. I'm honored.
Yeah. So I always like to start off with a quick cursory of, what are you, who are you, why are you, kind of your upbringing and how that relates to how you do life now, like kind of
Yeah.
just in brief that story, because I think
Yeah.
it's good to set that context, because
I
without context, not much
I
else was there.
I agree. I was so I was born in West Palm Beach, Florida, and I was a preacher's kid. My grandmother was a minister of the family. My mother would soon to follow, but not in the same capacity. And my grandmother, who back in the early 70s, I was born in 69, in the early 70s, she had established or helped to establish a missionary Baptist church in our hometown. And she had high hopes of doing ministry, and so she put forth money to help to charter the church and to establish the church. And the church, as of today, is doing very well. But I was raised up to be that kid to introduce my grandmother and and present her on stage while she presented the gospel, kind of trying to soften up the crowd, so to speak. Uh, Difficult for women in ministry. And so various traits of ministry, various understandings of ministry, the church just kind of naturally imbued themselves upon me. And later on in life, I decided to pursue ministry myself. But because of my grandmother's teaching, she was quite progressive in some respect. I always looked at ministry, the church, the gospel from a different perspective. And one would wonder what that perspective is, largely feminist, but also from a very loving and accepting perspective, which I think was also a tenet of my grandmother's pursuit of ministry, equality, sameness, compassion for all. And at some point, in pursuit of ministry and in pursuit of ministry, I realized there was something wrong. There was something absolutely wrong with not necessarily the gospel, but our interpretation of it.
Hmm.
And this allowed me, encouraged me to pursue other religious thinking, to surveil the parallels. And what I discovered was that within one of the most readily available religious encounters that we can have, Buddhism, lies a tremendous benefit to the believer in Christianity, and that is mindfulness. And so I began studying both, and I discovered that both Jesus and the Buddha had been pursuing the same thing, and that is liberation for human beings of their minds as well as their bodies. And in turn, if you correct these two, if you treat these two well, then it's a good possibility, very high possibility, that your neighboring community, your neighboring county, your state, your nation may wind up being a bit more healthy.
Hmm.
So, and out of those understandings of both Buddhism and Christianity morphed what I do now, which is considered Bodhi Christo, the awakened Christ. In one way, you can say that we are reliving the humanness of Christ with clear minds. We're examining our lives not only from a heavenly perspective, but also very earthbound perspective. They are components of our living here on earth, such as our psychologists,
Mm-hmm.
such as our mannerisms, those sorts of things. So Bodhi Christo is designed to live out the tacit, the hands-on, methods that Christ employed through the mindfulness of Buddha.
Hmm.
So,
What is, so you said the word, there's a couple of things there I want to circle back to. What is a feminine perspective of the gospel? You talked about you talked
yeah,
about that a bit. Like, what do you mean feminine
yeah,
perspective?
yes. So, the gospel largely throughout its history, especially here in this country, has been anti-women,
Mm-hmm.
in large part due to its translation or mistranslation of Paul's teachings regarding men and women in the church. And so my grandmother, wanted to, naturally being a woman and having her feelings and living on this earth and feeling everything that just everybody else does, she wanted to make sure that, wait a minute, you folks are not speaking of Christ enough over here for us womenkind. And she wanted to reveal more of a loving Christ, the Christ who's not, not quite like his father, who was a warmonger in some respects and stood up for those that he, particularly cared for, and not for those that he didn't. But more of a Christ image that was compassionate across the board. And so, from a feminist perspective, Christ is included completely in the gender roles of women. And she wanted to make sure that men weren't missing that.
Hmm.
Yes.
Hmm. So, if you can remember back, or maybe even to the culture that's in that church today, because you said it's still thriving,
Oh, yes.
what did that do to that congregation to have that view, that lens, preached to youth that now
Yeah.
are older? Like, how does, like, when you look at a traditional quote
Mm,
unquote church
yeah.
versus that, what are some of those differences? If someone's like, well, okay, but where
Yeah.
does that ultimately lead?
Right. Well, I can tell you this. My grandmother, had a large battle ahead of her, and it was a steadily, increasingly, you know, fiery, competition in the church. And then particularly with the men folk. But what it did was it did liberate many of the women to have a voice,
Hmm.
to speak up, and to make the men quite uncomfortable. So I think that after Granny began doing what she was doing, and she did it for a number of years until she passed. But she always spoke her truth, and her truth resonated so much with other women's truth. And I think what happened is, as a result of that, a concomitant result of that was many women began to help establish policy in the church. They began to establish clearer lines of understanding, and also began culturally within the institution itself to reinterpret many of its archaic viewpoints of women in the church by ordaining women in the
Hmm.
Baptist church, by allowing those women to speak from the same pulpit that the men spoke, and allowing those women to serve in positions of power, so to speak, such as trustees and stewards, and then also to make executive changes. So I
Yeah.
think she did a tremendous job in saying, look, we're not going to play this, you won't be game. God is bigger
Yeah.
than
Yeah. So not a Southern Baptist convention church then. Definitely
absolutely.
not. You talked about delving into different religious views as you kind of wandered.
Yeah.
And there are many other interviews with you as you talk a bit about, you were a pastor at one time,
Yeah.
correct? And
Yes,
and
that's
and,
correct.
and so I don't want to spend a lot of time there. I'd
Right.
like to try to cover some new ground or learn some more
Sure.
pieces about you.
Sure.
What are some of those other, or was it just you just jumped right from Christianity into kind of diving into Buddhism, or did you kind of, this isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, what
Yeah.
does that look like?
So for me, I think roughly around the age of 12, I began a more serious inquiry of religion, if you can believe that or not. And I think it was because my grandmother was so adamant, my mother as well, about learning. When I was growing up in the 70s, just about every household had Britannicas, and we had all of these learning materials and what
I
have you.
haven't thought about
Grandmother was
Britannicas
quite
in
adamant about
forever.
learning. Yeah, do you remember that?
Oh my gosh, I haven't thought about
Yeah.
those in a long time.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. And I was one of those kids who my grandmother and my mother made sure, especially being a young black boy from South Florida, you're going to learn. You're going to go to church and you're going to learn. And when you're not in church, you're going to be in a book somewhere.
Mm.
And I spent a lot of time learning. So I developed this understanding of other religions early on in life. And it was only in my pre-20s, maybe 18, 19 years old, that I began a serious inquiry into Buddhism because of personal anxiety and things of that sort. Um, and they grew on me. Buddhism led to the studying of yoga, and the beginning of the studying of Shiva and many other religions, Islam, a wide gamut of religions to be examined. And I found so many commonalities. And so after a ministry experience, uh, before I went full on Buddhist, before that, I had already determined that there needed to be, some sort of unifying, some sort of interreligious unity to live out these tenets that are found in all religions. It didn't make much to be Christian and broken, and recognizing that, well, there's a big part of my healing over there in Buddhism, but I can't do it because I'm Christian. I felt it necessary to combine the two. It's like looking at the medicine, but don't open the bottle.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I did. I began pursuing um, uh, Buddhism from a very tacit perspective, hands-on perspective, equal to what the Buddha did. The Buddha had studied for a long time with teachers, and then finally he just decided that no longer do I need a teacher. I'm going to find this thing on my own.
Yeah.
And so that is exactly what I did.
So I asked intentionally today.
Mhm.
I asked roughly 10 people at random. I actually asked them at work. So I work at a bank. I just, hey, random question while you're in before you leave. When I say the word Buddhism, what do you think?
Right.
And the people not being able to see this video won't get this, but they all went. Just one of those
Yeah.
like, and
Yeah.
there weren't many people that could really tell me.
Right.
But if I said Islam, they could tell me what they meant. Like if I
Sure.
said Christian, they would, even if they
Sure.
don't believe it, they would be able
Right.
to say, that's what those people do.
Yeah.
Christians, they go out on Sunday and they don't tip. I'm just
That's
joking.
right.
Just joking. But for real, that's what they do. So if you were to try to explain Buddhism to someone, and by someone I mean me,
Yeah.
uh, what would you say? Like,
Yeah.
what is Buddhism? And then more specifically, what is Zen Buddhism and how does it differ?
Yeah. Yeah. So Buddhism is, I'll give it to you as one great Zen master said, Buddhism is about recognizing that everything changes.
Hmm.
Everything changes. It is the cultivation of ultimate reality to oneself. And that ultimate reality is that we will all change. And there is no particular reason to hold on to any one notion, because that notion in and of itself or idea will change. The religion, the concept, the construct will change whether or not we are participating in its transmogrification or not. It's going to change. And that's what Buddhism is largely based upon. Notions, thoughts, memories, history, trauma, all of those things, they happen to us and we act those things out as if they're actually happening to us every moment of our lives.
Hmm.
And so Buddhism is a teaching, a way of life, a number of practices, even a philosophy that teaches through various methods and portals, through various teachings, to recognize that the psychological constructs, even the emotional manifestations that we are experiencing as human beings, usually are stemming from one or two places, either from some sort of illusory past or some sort of traumatic past experience, or we are reaching towards some sort of unmaterialized goal that is stressing us out, and we have not attained it yet. And in both of those time spheres, both of those dimensions, we do a great deal of laboring about things that have come and gone. And we try to live those things out in the third period of time that's always transitory and moving about, and that is the present moment. So I often say that we're all victims of the post-traumatic stress disorder of our parents. And then we go off and live our lives. But here's the issue. We live our lives growing up as human beings, going from decade to decade, and we vacillate from past to future and never live our lives in the present moment. In other words, so many people are so concerned about getting to heaven that they are not altruistic, they're not concerned about other people, and they don't seem to be greatly concerned about doing things to enhance other people's well-being on this planet.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so concerned about where they're going instead of
Right,
finding the kingdom of God that
right.
we are participating in and helping to create.
Yeah.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah.
Also, you talk about the post-traumatic stress disorder of our parents. Makes me wonder what I'm doing to the children that sleep above me. When you, so I have to think that you're familiar. Although I do have another question about specifically the difference between that philosophy and then specifically what Zen Buddhism is.
Zen Buddhism, right.
But are you familiar with, so you talked about paths of, oppression based on trauma. And then you talked about another one of, just like ascending to, I'm going to grasp this because I feel motivated to do it. That reminds me of a conversation I've had with my pastor in the past about Richard Rohr has these two paths of, you can fall upward or you can fall downward, like an oppressive path and then a subversive path.
Right.
Are you familiar at all with that? Does that hold any truth to kind of what you're talking about, or
I think no? I'm understanding the concept. I'm not familiar with that particular.
Yeah, I'm going to badly paraphrase this. So it's like a central line that he would call your essence, and the goal is that you're born that way, and that you hopefully ascend or descend back to that central line as you pass. And as trauma happens, you either build an ego that presses others down to elevate your own ego.
Yeah.
And you, every time that happens, you get further and further above and like narcissistic tendencies.
Absolutely.
Or you instead just go, yeah, of course, I was supposed to be beat down. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to speak out. And you just continue to submit and submit and submit until you're so far away to what you were actually created as.
Right.
If that makes any sense.
It does. It does. So in Zen Buddhism, I will begin by saying he's absolutely right. We're all born with a natural primordial state, and that primordial state is pure. We are already enlightened. We need not pursue anything else. It is a given. You come here enlightened, and then then there's some programming that's offered to you, some software that you upload, and it is usually someone else's information. And then you go on about living your life. Now, within that information that you're given are certain prerequisites of behavior, prerequisites of or suggested tendencies for behavior, or demonstrated actions towards certain experiences that will prompt a behavior. And in that respect, he's absolutely right. We vacillate back and forth because we kind of get away from our primordial state. Zen is about focusing completely on the primordial state. One of the practices that we do here, which is called Daishin Zen, is allowing yourself to kind of visually imagine yourself standing above, yourself, as if you're seated and you're standing above yourself, right behind you, with your hands on your shoulders. And this particular methodology that we use represents the primordial state. We are minds that are capable of doing, but unless you actually intentionalize the doing, or what is in the mind, nothing will actually be done. No further karma will be added to you. So Daishin Zen is this way of watching yourself, observing yourself, being clear in the primordial moment, the natural moment, the present moment. And as things materialize around you, all you're doing is being an observer of those things. You're participating in the mere fact that you're observing, awareness. This is, in some respect, we consider Christ consciousness, awareness, being mindful. So in that respect, Zen urges us at all times to be in a meditative state, to always be observant of what you're doing, and paired against or with, or in association with, the Buddha Dharma, the teachings of the three gates: speak only if it's necessary, true, or kind.
Are those the three gates: necessary, true, and kind?
Is it necessary? Is it true? And is it kind? And that is the basis for how one lives as a Daishin Zen practitioner. Is it necessary? Do you even need to open your mouth? Do you need to have an opinion on certain things? Is it true? Is it true? We are so often, as Father Roy points out, we take sometimes a submissive role in society, and we do that under pressure. Sometimes when human pressure is a bit too much for us, like someone asking us a question or asking us to be vulnerable, we will lie, or we will take a lesser grandeur stance on that. So, is it true? And if it is not, then refrain from speaking until you practice being honest with yourself. So, and then, is it kind? Is it truly kind? Here in the South, we have this kind of mannerism where people are always smiling at each other, but deep down within, there's this ambivalence, or this apathy we have with each other. Oh, bless your heart. Those sorts of So Daishin Zen suggests that if it is not kind, and it is not genuinely kind, if it is not genuinely true, if it is not genuinely necessary, then do not engage or entangle yourself in the affairs of falsehood. So that is the methodology of maintaining this primordial state that Father Roy talks about, and that I think Buddha and the Jesus encouraged us to remain in.
Yeah, I like those three gates. Yeah, I find myself thinking, how can I apply those three gates to social media? Because I'll type, and then just delete, save as drafts. No, I better not, because I'll pull it back out and do it again. I better not. Yeah. So what are some of the other, so Zen Buddhism is just one form. So are there others? And can you speak to that at all? Or is like, what are the differences?
Sure. Buddhism is, a cultural manifestation. It was born out of India. Siddhartha Gautama, who was a prince who later would abandon all formal pursuits of gaining enlightenment through teachers and masters and gurus. He abandoned all of those pursuits to seek enlightenment himself. And what he discovered was, wow, he himself could be brought back to the natural state of all is well, all is good, and all of this stuff going on around me is changing. He brought himself to enlightenment. And many others came after him. He had many students, and they would later take those teachings and separate them, kind of divide them up in various teachings, and use those as cultural guides or norms to teach the Buddha Dharma. One of the schools, the oldest school of Buddhism, is called Theravada. And it is generally characterized by the original teachings of the Buddha from when the Buddha was here on earth as a living human being. and they are generally characterized, the monks are characterized by refraining from any sexual activity. They're very abstinent. They have a certain diet that they eat, and they're generally marked by orange robes, and largely of Asian descent.
Mm-hmm.
And that's largely because when Bodhidharma, the 12th century monk and founder of Zen Buddhism, traveled from Tibet to Korea and later China and Japan, he shared the Buddha Dharma there, and they adopted it, and it became a part of their cultural anomaly. One of the other schools, so it is Theravadan Buddhism is called the oldest school
Okay.
in the schools of Buddhism, and then there is the Mahayana. Mahayana Buddhism is more so Tibetan Buddhism, some schools of Zen Buddhism, but Mahayana is called the lesser vehicle because it allows certain teachings to be expounded upon, more so, I think, in the monastic or the followers' individual life. So we're not bound by, in many cases, some of the more stricter rules of Theravadan Buddhism. I tend to think Mahayana Buddhism is more individual or family oriented, I guess.
Okay.
The practice is around your community. The practice is more so around the things that you do every single day, not just being caught in the monastery, but the things you do every day. And then Zen Buddhism is a part of the school of Mahayana Buddhism. However, Zen focuses on particularly emptiness, the emptiness of all things. We place so much emphasis on importance, spiritual materialism, those sorts of things, gain, wealth, acquiring. And Zen Buddhism teaches from a very dire perspective that all things are empty. All things are empty. A piece of gold or a ring or a diamond left unattended for a number of years, it will become tarnished. And it will need some cleaning up. It will need some adjusting in order to return to its full luster.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Zen Buddhism focuses on that particular aspect. There are things about you. There are post-traumatic stress disorders of your parents, of racism, of living in the country, of your job, of of even what you've been told of yourself before you even knew yourself. Zen Buddhism encourages really get to know whom you are and shed the dross, shed the outer layers of all of the sensationalism of the delusions that propagate for your mind. You see.
Yeah. So when you say emptying, I think that's what you said was emptying.
Yes.
Why? How do I want to say this? So I don't know how to say this. I'm struggling. So what I'm finding is I struggle when I'm talking with people of other faiths, which is actually stretching me quite a bit. I don't have the same common foundational nomenclature to fall back on.
Right.
So often I struggle to put questions together. Why does it matter? Like when I hear emptying, I hear that I'm like abandoning things, if that makes sense. Like I'm gonna like just literally just checking out, and almost like, because I think things have value. Sure. And so, but I also can see the draw of not being addicted to that value. So how does that work? Like, how does one begin that process? And I don't even know if I'm saying that right.
Oh, yeah, you believe it or not, you're doing a wonderful job.
Fair enough.
Fantastic. Some of the questions that people normally pose to me, I have to think about because I'm not exactly sure what they're saying. But you're very clear.
Okay.
If you consider, and I'll try to do this in a very allegorical perspective, but be as clear as I possibly can. If you consider a flower, one single rose, the rose in and of itself is made of many things. Mm-hmm. It is comprised of sunlight, and it has some interaction during its development with bugs, rain, wind, all of those sorts of things, soil. So when we look at the full completion of what a flower is, we are fascinated by its beauty. We are overwhelmed by what it now, in its completed stasis, will further provide for us, a bouquet of flowers, some sort of way of enlightening or enlivening one's visual day to kind of stimulate the mind, for whatever case it may be. But when the rose continues on, it's in its stasis or in its transformation, it will die. And notice when the flower dies, what happens to our minds? Our minds immediately go back to, well, it's worthless now. I have to change it out. I have to do something else in order to sustain this.
Yeah.
We
Prune it off.
sometimes will, yeah.
Yeah.
And so emptiness is the practice of understanding this beautiful manifestation that you are looking at, this beautiful piece of earthbound work that you had very little to do with it coming up, in its original form was not this way. And that in its original form, it's made of other components that we would not value as much as we value its completed form. So Zen is about recognizing, oh, this is a beautiful flower, but there's much more that went into it to make it such, and to be aware of those things that contributed to this manifestation. So emptiness is about understanding that, oh yes, money is very useful and it can help a lot of people, but in the end, we should look at money as it can be useful, it can be helpful, but it in many cases is not the determining factor for happiness. And when we censor our understanding that these things are not worth what we're putting into them, when we censor that, then we go full bore into attainment mode. Many of us have attained egohood and not enlightenment through our misunderstanding of our relationship to all things. We've attained egohood. My shoes are more important. My spot in the line in traffic is more important, and you should cut me off, those sorts of
I
things.
struggle with that. I've got a 40-minute drive to work. And some days I'm like, what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
The yield sign. What's wrong with you?
Yeah. Well, what's worse is I think we had someone who visited. She said, on Sundays, I'm supposed to be holy, but I get so upset because people are keeping me from church. And, I said, wow, yeah, maybe you should come here on Sundays a bit more.
I want to dive into Sunday. So you used a word earlier, Bodhi Christo.
Yes.
And I forget what you said. That means something Christ, and I don't.
Yes, it's awakened Christ.
Yeah. So what in the world is that? Like,
yeah. So Bodhi Christo, I'm glad you're asking. Bodhi Christo is the path. I've termed it such simply because in the years that I've been a monk and the years that I've been doing this work and this meditative practice, I've discovered that both Jesus and the Buddha, had they existed at the same time, they would have probably gotten along very well. And I think that is because Jesus is often referred to as the Son of God, but there's something else he's often called, and that is the Son of Man. I think it is the man side, the human side of Jesus that we are so undereducated in as a human society, that we are so undereducated in and misinformed about as a Christian society, that it warrants, us investigating, simply because without understanding his human side, I don't believe that we will ever understand his divine side. What I mean by that is there are certain things, there are certain actions that are represented in Scripture that are very clear of Jesus's belief of other human beings. For example, Jesus was noted to go and sit next to a woman who was, considered not to be a holy person, or and it was against the rule for men to sit with women and talk with them if they were entrolled, or if they were married, or whatever. And Jesus broke those rules to connect to human beings. He understood that human beings need love and association. And he dared to do that with his divinity. He uh, even celebrated human beings, because he was a human being, during their most culturally festive times.
Mm-hmm.
When the water was no longer, when the wine was no longer sufficient, he created more harmonious community by adding more wine. Jesus was very aware of the human manifestation of our being here on earth, and he tended to that. He said a lot of things that were very mystical, but what he did do was he did not hold himself up to be this high person. And he was capable of walking the earth in his bare shoes and sandals and touching people right where they were.
Mm-hmm.
Bodhi Christo is that manifestation of doing what Christ did, but doing it firstly from a very awakened perspective. You see, I believe that what many of us have done throughout the course of history is we've acted out these Jesus beliefs, but we have not included the true nature of ourselves in it. And this is we've not nurtured the human side. We know how to get people to heaven and know how to tell them how they're going to hell. But as far as helping people to overcome self-doubt, helping people to overcome, a lack of feeling connected to other human beings. Some people have traumas that they're having a difficult time living with, and prayer alone is not enough. So I think Jesus would have demonstrated, as he did through the narratives, a human connection. Get next to those people, talk to those people, be willing to have town hall with those people, and nurture them right where they are. I often have said in a number of interviews and lectures and talks that I give all across this great country, that I think in large part we have failed as a Christian society because we have not been human.
Mm.
We have tried so desperately to be divine that we have left behind the very source of whom we are, you see. And, so Bodhi Christo is the manifestation of a Buddhist monk who deeply believes in the narratives and the actions of Jesus, and from an enlightened or awakened perspective, who lives that out. I live my life out as a person who firstly focuses on me. And for whatever time that takes for me to sort out my stuff, to be clear, to let go of some things and come to a greater understanding, I take that time so that when I do set forth out into the world and put my hands to other people's hands, they are a little cleaner than they were before I put my hand to theirs. And so Bodhi Christo, firstly, is about becoming the Buddha that you naturally are. And then through the patterning of what has already been established in this country, Christ, the Christ narrative, living that out in one's life and in society. Yes.
Yeah. So I have two more questions, actually. Well, maybe two, maybe 20. We'll see where it goes.
That's quite all right.
So I have found when I speak to people that are Buddhists, which oddly enough takes a bit of time to get out of people, like as I meet people, it doesn't seem to be the Buddhists I've spoke with. They don't just come out, like they don't proselytize in the way that Christians do, which I appreciate, because I'm like, I just want to talk about God.
I just want,
and we can call it whatever you want to talk about. I'm going to learn something today. I think if anybody in a church went and then they came to your centers at Thomasville, that they would be welcomed by everyone present. But I don't know if someone showed up dressed in robes, like as a Buddhist monk, if they would immediately not be welcome at most churches. So I'm curious, how do you think that should look? Like, how can it has to be reciprocal? How can that work better? Like, what would you say?
I'm actually working with a number of Buddhists, Buddhist lamas, Buddhist teachers from traditional lineages all across the globe. We're working together right now. And this has been going on for some time. Many people have not known of this, but one of the things that we're doing is we're working to make this this material, this a manifestation of Buddhists who understand the need, first of all, for recognizing the Christ figure of history, and then also for Christians to recognize the Buddhist image and narrative of history. And I think we're working together because we simply understand that Buddhists have been so isolated towards the monastery, towards sending out goodwill and compassion and things of that nature, but never really having any tacit knowledge. And what I mean by that is actually putting their feet, the rubber to the road. And in many cases, Christians have a great deal of talk about compassion and love and kindness and things of that sort. But
talk being the key word there.
Right, but never really fully understanding what that looks like within themselves. We talk about forgiveness, but we don't know how to forgive. So Buddhists and Christians coming together can certainly, and I know it's somewhat of a morphing process. It's a transmogrification that's kind of difficult to understand, but not quite so. The Good Samaritan, took away from his day to just simply recognize another human being who was in distress. And with or without any knowledge, he participated. I always say that comprehension is not a requisite for cooperation. And so these are things that I think together as Christians and Buddhists, we can benefit from learning of each other. We could benefit as Buddhists learning to take into a word, I think benefit people, and people can benefit us as well. You see?
So I do want to ask kind of how you think that looks like with faiths that aren't Christian based, like Islamic and other faiths as well. But for some reason, there's a nagging question in the back of my head. So when I think about Christ and living water, you don't thirst anymore. That seems to be the opposite of emptying. So can you talk a bit about that? Because it's been nagging me for about 20 minutes now. I finally figured out how to say it.
So I think one of the things that most people do is they misunderstand because there isn't depth. So emptiness. If you are empty, then how big are you? How vast are you? How limited are you? How extraordinary are you? So when Christ talks about this overflowing, never running out stream of water full of richness that we can all benefit from, and it's there for us eternally, everlasting, the Buddhist concept of emptiness is the same teaching. You see, Christ indicated that he is a well that'll never run dry simply because he is rooted not in the things that plague our minds. He is not rooted in the societal norms and understanding of what life really is. And the Buddha made that perfectly clear as well. And you have to ask yourself, what problems do we have in life as human beings? And we can give a myriad of answers, but there is only but one problem that each and every one of us have. And that is life is not happening the way that you want it to. And so Christ says, if you live this very simple way, without reaching and grasping for anything, you have to recognize, Christ said, if you even want eternal life, you've got to give it all up. You have to be empty. You have to release. You have to let go. You have to go back to that very primordial state to decontaminate yourself from the things that plague your mind to make you think that these are more important. So emptiness is of the same thing. Emptiness is the same as Christ's teaching of abandoning your riches. Yeah, it's the same concept. If you know, Daishin means big mind in Japanese culture. It means big mind, and it's not in terms of capacity. It's in terms of emptiness. If the universe had 21 different locations, verifiable locations, only 21 verifiable locations in the universe, and we could go to them, then everyone would have this common knowledge that, well, there's only 21 locations, you know, that we can go to. But now, as we discover, the universe is vast. And so now to limit the universe to only 21, just because we see 21, limits our perception, limits our ability to go beyond, you see. So does that help you a bit?
Yeah, it does. Especially that last bit of, you know, just because I see 21, it's only 21. Yeah. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I want to end with this question. So people are listening, and then just so you kind of know, I plan, and I'm actually really struggling with it, but this is the plan. I want to speak with as many other faith traditions or other thoughts as possible, because I think it's important to learn how to do that better. And maybe we'll all learn a little bit together, because I don't even know what I don't know, to borrow something from Donald Rumsfeld. Like I literally struggle with things. So yes, I've reached out with so many other different faiths, and so far those are coming. I don't know how long it'll be or how many different faiths I'll talk with, but whatever.
Well, hopefully many. Hopefully you'll get a chance.
I hope so. I'm looking forward to it. So where would you point people to as they want to dive into some of these concepts, to learn a little bit more? You talked about, you know, religious practice of contemplation and liberation, and so many different things that we've talked about. So where would you say, hey, if you were going to start in one or two spots with intentionality, you know, drill here. This is where you want to drill.
I would suggest, you know, all of my students across the globe are suggested reading materials, and we study together, and I'm very intimate with all of them. We spend time equal as to what we're doing here, communicating and practicing together. But one of the foundational tools that I use in order to help students to understand Buddhism, whether they be Christian or otherwise. Many of my students are not Buddhist. Many of them are Christian. Many of them are Hindu, and from various religious backgrounds. Mm-hmm. There's a particular book called Buddhism, Plain and Simple, by my good friend Steve Hagen. And it's called Buddhism, Plain and Simple, by Steve Hagen. And in this particular book, it's written from a lay perspective. Steve outlines, you know, what Buddhism is, and it talks to the individual directly. It's very, very poignant in talking about what Buddhism is, the beginning of it, how you approach this, and then also the similarities of other thoughts as well. Mm-hmm. You know, so that particular book, Buddhism Plain and Simple by Steve Hagen, is a great resource. Perfect. And I've had people who have read that book and reread it because it is so insightful, especially for the Westerner. Here in the West, we have a concept even of meditation, that meditation is, you know, getting to this blissful state and all things just kind of disappear from your mind. That is not the case. As we've discovered in Buddhism, true Buddhism, meditation is allowing the madness of your mind to reveal itself while you sit quietly and let it allow itself to act it out. Hmm. That is what meditation is. Because if you cannot see the things that plague you, then you will never know exactly how to deal with them.
Yeah. I've practiced that through different forms of prayer down here in the basement, about 10 feet to my right here. I read a book. I read a lot of books, but I read a book about a year and a half ago from the name escapes me now, but it's about truth, prayer, and identity. And so he has a concept of there just being quiet and just being still and listening until all you can hear is the silence.
That's right.
And like literally can hear the fibers of the carpet that you're sitting on.
Absolutely.
And then you can actually focus your attention on something that matters. And I'm not saying that well. He said it so much better. James Danaher, that's his name. James Danaher. Truth, Prayer, and Identity. That's the name of that book. I can't cheat. I don't actually have it bound. I had a
Right.
loose copy, so I can't just look at my books.
You got to get your notes together there.
Yeah, well, it's in the back of the brain in there somewhere. So thank you so much, Bushi. I've really enjoyed this.
You're very
I have
welcome.
so many other questions, but yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. And if anyone would like to continue to reach out to me or to follow me, they can do so at a number of portals. Bushispeace.us, BUSHISPEACE.us. And then you can just type in Bushi on Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, and they can locate me there.
Good. And I'll link to all those in the show notes as well.
Thank you so much.
Perfect. So I do have another question. Why
Right.
the Japan? This has nothing to do with the episode, but why the Japanese verbiage? Because like YamatoDamashii, doesn't that mean like warrior something or other?
Yes.
Like why that?
Yeah. So from the time I was 11 years old, I've been a martial artist.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still a practicing martial artist today.
Okay.
Japanese martial arts, Aikido, Daitoru, Aikijujutsu, Seshido-ru.
I don't even know what those words are. Those aren't even real words. I don't even know what that means.
I have black belts in all of these arts. And so when I decided to become a more serious practitioner, my teacher suggested a name for me to go into meditation with. And that was warrior of the ancient Japanese spirit, Bushi YamatoDamashii. And that name was given to me because, just like most of us who receive Dharma names, there was something within me that he intended to see me live out. And that is to be a warrior towards my own life circumstances. And to do that through the spirit and the energy of the practice that I had already cultivated, which is a mastery of several martial arts, and do that now with your mind. So I was given that name for that particular reason.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So you become the samurai of your own mind, and then you can see clearly where not to cut other people.
Fair enough. I like that. One other question. So when I Googled you, it appears that there was a book that somebody said you were writing that maybe out November of last year, but I can't find it.
Yeah,
So
it's actually,
it?
It has not been released yet. We're still working this, as we're discovering, as this work is unfolding, more and more people are grabbing at this concept, grabbing at the notion that there's a Buddhist Christian, somewhere in the world. And it's, so the book is taken a little bit more time to come about, but we are still working on it. And hopefully by July of this year, we'll be able to say, all right, it's done. I've been talking with some of my colleagues who are helping me with this, and hopefully by July.
That sounds good.
Yeah. And if not, then, maybe Christmas, it'll be a great Christmas present.
Yeah. I was like, I know how Google works and I can't find this thing, but it is referenced. Where is it? So
yeah. And you and I were talking about God earlier.
Oh yeah. No, I totally forgot. I'm gonna edit this back in. Oh man, I'm glad. Thank you so much for reminding me. So when you I got sidetracked. And I will edit this back in. So so one of the questions I'm asking everyone is that because and that's why I wanted to set context at the beginning of kind of your story. I think where people come from matters for this answer. And as I talk to people of other faiths, other cultures, it's just different. So when you say the word God or divine or whatever metaphor you want to say, what do you mean?
What do I mean?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I have to say, Seth, this is the first time anyone has ever asked me that question.
No.
Usually this particular question is answered within my inner circle so as to not cause controversy, because some people may not understand, but I'm pretty sure that given enough patience and tolerance, it's a really good answer as to what I mean. So I grew up understanding that God was in the clouds, beyond the clouds, from a very elementary perspective. And then later I matriculated to know or to believe that God was this being who was supreme over all things, watching all things, in all things, all manifestations of human life and in the earth. and that God had a tendency of acting on the behalf of human beings, acting against them. God had certain rules. This being had certain tenets that he wanted us to follow. And as I developed as a human being and grew up, I came to realize that with all of the God talk, you know, Phyllis Tickle once wrote a book called God Talk in America. With all of this God talk, it's becoming quite difficult to feel God in my human flesh, simply because other human beings don't carry the same image that I have.
Mm.
So when we talk about God, God is in many cases relegated to a Sunday morning phenomena, a person or deity or construct to rely on, you know, a counterpart in struggle to cast your woes upon, you know, those sorts of things. And that anything you need as a human being, you know, God gives you these things. Like, as if you can't work on patience yourself, you have to rely on God. You can't work on courage yourself, you have to rely on God. You can't work on peace, you have to rely on God. And living in the flesh, you see, my hide could not agree with many of the sentiments that were taught to us in the church about God, God's attributes, those sorts of things. And what I later discovered was that if we're going to talk about God, then I think we have to be involved in that process. So when I speak of God, I speak of the ultimate good of our greatest human endeavors, the greatest good, and whatever that is. God would look like, if you're feeling bad, you know, spontaneously lift yourself because of some notion that you are truly already enlightened. God looks like someone who breaks away from the norm of apathy to spontaneously do something kind for someone else.
Mm.
God looks like, you know, someone taking time out of their day to forthrightly and as an individual set aside their worries and go cast some concern somewhere else with someone else's issues. You know, so God is about connecting with human beings in all of the enterprise of humanity, the suffering, the triumphs, all of those things. And when we speak of God, those should be the narratives that we sell to ourselves, that we offer our own psychologies regarding what we're speaking about. So, you know, God is bigger than anything that we've ever done on the planet. And if the condition of the planet is any indication of how well we've done with God, then you know, my definition of God is much bigger than that.
Yeah. 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 I love that. I love that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for reminding me. Yeah.
You caught me on the cuff, so I had to try, but I did remember. You know,
Well, thank you for refocusing me. I had totally forgot.
yeah.
I would have kicked myself. Matter of fact, I probably would have called you again and hit record again and be like, we still have to do this. Because I can't, I've done every single week now. I can't miss one. I can't miss one.
I get it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this, and
I have as well, Seth.
yeah, good. Well, it is getting late, and I'm sure I've taken you away from your family for long enough. So,
Oh, well, you know, I'm silent for 18 hours of the day. I actually took a nap around 2 o'clock this afternoon just to get up around 8:30 to connect with you.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, and for your time again tonight. I very much appreciate it.
All right.
All right. You have a good night.
You too, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.
Thank you, sir. Bye.
All right.